Goed, ek is gevra om, ek is Schlo van Namibië, van Grootfontein. Ek het daar groot geword en saam met die Brahmane groot geword van ek 'n kind was. Ek wil net kortlik sê, ek het van 4 of 5 mense in Suid-Afrika geleer. Eers is my pa, dan is dit oom Theo, Llewellyn en dan is daar seker nog 1 of 2 and that's it. Ek is gevra om my speech in Engels te doen, maar as julle wil kan ek dit in Duits doen. Ek het 'n paar goed hier opgeskryf en ek is gevra om veral te kyk na die jonger mense wat hier is wat nog nie baie kennis van Brahmane het en na die teelers wat nog nie lank Brahmane teel. So hier is goed in wat vir julle ander mense dalk eentonig sal voorkom of wat julle al lankal weet. So maar wees maar geduldig, ek sal maar daar moet deurgaan. Soos julle almal weet, die Brahmane het in Texas begin, hoofsaaklik op die Gulf Coast van Amerika. En dit was die invoere wat voor die 1800s en tydens die 1800s gedoen is. Daar was 2 jare, 1849 en 1854, waar die eerste Zebus, ons praat nog nie van Brahmane, ons praat van Zebus, ingekom het. En daar was verskillende strains, verskillende soorte, alle kleure, daar was nie 'n stelsel nie. Hulle het net Zebus ingebring. En daar was 2 persone wat julle die name later weer sal hoor, dit was John Kiran en Shanghai Pierce, wat toe later weer 2 bulle ingebring het, en dit is toe gebruik op die Barrow Great Cattle. Dit was graadbeeste wat op die Gulf Coast rondgeloop het, en die mense het agtergekom, hierdie beeste het 'n spesifieke eienskap wat die ander diere nie het nie. En dit was aanpasbaarheid teen vliee, teen bosluise was hulle baie resistant gewees. Daar was ook tydens daai tyd 'n jong bul wat tevore gekom het en sy naam was Prins. En dan het die groot invoere gekom wat vandag relevant is. Dit was in 1923 en daarna, dan is die regte pyltjie kry. En daar was 'n paar invoere en in 1923-24 het die Southwells veral meneer Southwell, hy was die persoon wat agter dit was dat die genootskap kon gestig gewees het. En van daar af het hulle dan diere geregistreer. En nommer 1 was die eerste en so het hulle aangegaan. Dan moet ek eers my prul kry. Daar was 2 belangrike invoere. Tydens daai tyd in 1946 waar hulle twee groot getalle bulle ingebring het en wat toe in vandag se Brahmane baie belangrik is, die lyne wat toe ontstaan het. Want verskillende teelers het met verskillende tipes gewerk en met verskillende bulle en dit het verskillende lyne veroorsaak. So ek wil net hê ons jong teelers moet begin verstaan, daar is verskillende lyne. Daar was die AP Borden herd, wat ons gesê het in 1800 something het hulle al diere ingebring en Shanghai Pierce. Daai manne het geboer op so 25.000 eikers. Hulle het nie drade geken, hulle het net op en afgetrek die hele tyd. En dan het hulle opgestoot om hulle diere te bemark. En daai kudde is toe later oorgegee aan die volgende generasie. Dit was die AP Ranch en John Runnels se Runnels Peeskudde. En die AP Ranch het meer al, ja, the AP herd was more the Imperator herd and the Runnels Peers went a little bit into the Indo-Brazil and some red cattle. Then we come to the Southwell herd, which was a very important herd even up to today, and they were responsible for the Imperator line, which they created. And still, as I said, today, the youngsters, they still have the same line, and they always try and upgrade it with lines out of the Imperators, like from the Marceaus and like from the AP Ranch even, and from the Stewarts. Then we had an important herd in terms of the red cattle, that was the Fondren estate, and they, by that time, selected for color, and they took out of the national herd animals that were either yellowish or red or brownish, and they tried to breed them to red color, and they even used bulls, there was a certain bull from Hudgins that they didn't want because he had the wrong color. So the foreign estate got him. And this herd still exists today. It's called the Santa Elena Ranch. It went through different generations and it became the Santa Elena because Vincent Lecuna from Venezuela bought it, and he still had the same recipe. He always brought back Manzo bulls into that herd to make them more beefy. The Hudginses, they had a bull which they got hold of. They bought him from a lady, and his name was Manzo. But the Hudginses had many bulls. There were names like we still even get today because they ran out of names, like Josiah, like Martin, and many other bulls. In those years, they didn't only have Manzo, but they used Manzo to line breed. And Edgar Hudgins, he was the one that was fond of it, doing it, line breeding, and always going back to Manzo and outbreeding a little bit here and there and going back to Manzo. So he had a system how he did it. And that was a Manzo line breeding program that he actually invented. Not invented, guys that went to college and to university know how to do it. Mr. Henry Coons, I'm talking about 1900s, 1923, not Henry Clay. That was Mr. Henry. He had the Gujarat type of cattle, and he was very known for that, the HCK cattle. At one time, they were even more sought after than the Hudgins' Manzo cattle were. And some of these cattle came to South Africa as well. Later on, his ranch was split into 3 divisions. His one daughter, they carried on with the name HCK. And Emily Dial, she went back to the Gujarat type of cattle and she had the 3X. And Henry Clay decided he wants to go to red. So he took his base of cattle he had from his dad and he put red bulls on. But old Mr. Henry Coons was known for the Suva line, which came out of his cattle. And in recent years, the bull Suva 203 came of that line, and the bull Lockmore in Florida came also out of that line. Then in Florida, we had Mr. Henry Pardon, which bought the Emperor bull from the Southwells, which also came out of the Imperator line, and the Florida cattle are different to the Texas cattle. Then we had a man in Louisiana, A.J. Marceau, and he had a very interesting setup, but he was actually inbreeding, which is very dangerous. We will come to it later. So we rather stay with line breeding if we want to do it. Then we had another group of guys in the southern part of Texas, the Garcia brothers. They stayed opposite the road. One brother was here and the other one was there, and they were always fighting. Very short-tempered guys. But they had good cattle. They were mostly Indu type, but I'm talking about the Mexican Indu type. It's not the Brazilian one. The Mexican Indu type is more a Gujarat cross Indu type of cattle. And they were very influential in the red cattle later on because they had the opportunity to give a little bit of an outcross now and then. And they were also known for using the Rio Negro bull to get the red color into their cattle because they mostly had gray Indu type cattle. The Cherokee Ranch, who was owned by Cy Yoakum. Cy Yoakum was a very interesting man. He had a little bit of Indian ancestry in his own genes. And he was the red guy, like Hudgins was the gray breeder with line breeding. That was Cy Yoakum with the red cattle. He was an expert on line breeding and putting lines together and outcrossing them if it was necessary and bringing them back together. And you will see in all the red cattle today, don't matter where you go, you will find his blood, his cattle's blood. The Clifford brothers, they went a little bit away from that, but still they used the Rio Negro line and they bred a very good bull out of that, which was 730, Rio Red King 730, which also went to the McKellars, a lot of those lines. Then we had the Wee8 Ranch in those years, which was owned by Howard Parker, and those were mostly Gujarat type of grey cattle. As you all know, your Gujarat has more the flat head and the horns going upwards, and the open big ear, and quite long as well. But they are big-framed, heavy-boned cattle. And today, the V8 ranch is still in existence, but it was sold to Schlo Williams, and it's operated by Sun today, and they have changed a little bit, but they still have those old genes at the back door. They can always fall back to it. J.T. White was also another very important breeder, he and his wife, and they had also bigger type of cattle, Imperator influenced, but bigger than the Imperators that we know. And Johnny Jeffcoat later used a lot of those cattle, and you will know them. They even went sometimes too tall, the later generations. But you will still find this blood in the Hudgins and V8 and people that bought cattle from Johnny Jeffcoat. Sugarlands Ranch in Florida. As I said before, the Florida type of cattle, which were influenced by the aristocratas, the imperators, and they even put Hudgins Manzo on later on those lines. And they had a very famous person which managed the ranch. His name was Sid Crochet. You will talk to Sidney Hunt, and he will tell you everything about those cattle. And they had a bull by the name of Albacrat the Jr., and he came from A.J. Marceau in Louisiana. And later on, they put different lines into the program to widen the genetic base and to create different lines. And they bought Loxigamel, and they had a Souville bull, and they had the Esther Imperator bull, and they made these lines out of their old cattle. But a very important bull, even in today's terms, in Sydney and even Bos Blanco, they use those lines, is the Rex Crata. Sugarlands Rex Crata 229 was a very famous bull from the beginning, which they bred. Had a lot of Albacrat the Junior blood, but he was a grandson of Loxigamel because his sire was not Loxigamel. His sire was Sugarlands Rex Manzo 48. And the Rex line, in today's terms in South Africa, you will know that Alf Kutze he was fond of the Rex line, but Eric Bilzer, he was fond of the lock cattle. They were bigger and heavier boned, and Bos Blanco also likes the cattle that came from not far from here, from a tomato farm, and they were Leon lock cattle. Different lines than the Rex lines. But the Rex lines worked nice on these heavier, more rugged cattle. Henry Clay Koens himself, we talk red cattle now, had a lot of cattle that he upgraded out of his grey cattle and reddish cattle, and he put two bulls from Sayokums that he mainly used. He also used many other bulls, but he mainly used two bulls, Vernon 489 and Cherokee Torgerson 344, and then he played those two lines, and he always infused new ones, and he bred back to those lines, and that's how he carried on. And later on, he got the millionaire out of that line. Let's go to the next point now, and that's where our speech actually starting now. The use of pedigrees. Why do we use pedigrees? It's a very good tool given to us to breed and select cattle. There are many other tools, as you know, that shouldn't be underestimated, so it all has to be used in balance. There are many lines of cattle, and there are many families of cattle. If we look at the grey cattle, we have from many years back the Aristocrata and the Manzo and the Imperator, and another Southwell line that was the Emperor that went to Florida. Then we had the Suva line, which was created out of the Henry Koens cattle. The Mucho Grande came from Emeril Dial. They were Gujarat type of cattle. And the V8 ranch, those years by Howard Parker, was also Gujarat type of cattle, which came from William State Jacobs. He was a breeder that had pure Gujarats by that time. He was fond of breeding the pure ones, and he kept them together. They were registered as AA Gujarat in the association. The red Brahman lines, many red lines that came, which we still use today, I cannot tell you all of them, but just for interest, the Rautu, Rio Negro, Gaucho, and later on developed out of that was the Vernon and the Torgerson line. And somewhere in the 70s, 80s, different people imported semen from Mexico or even Brazil, and the McKellar and the 5P ranches created quite some good bulls out of those lines. Now coming back to pedigrees, why do we use and study pedigrees? There's a lot of reasons. Show cattle help us to breed cattle with more class and style. We can find bulls that breed an increased percentage of show winners, so we have to identify them. We use breed plan, which is very important, and pedigrees work hand in hand. You cannot just have breed plan or pedigrees, they work hand in hand. They should be used together. You must look at both of them. Then we talk of cows again. You have to study your cows that perform above average and even have produced a herd sire or a few. We study bulls and their offspring to identify their strong points. We use pedigrees to assist us with giving our own herd an identity. We can decide which lines to use and which we don't want to use, because we are all individuals, we are different people, and we live in different areas. We cannot all use the same lines and the same cattle. So, and you want your herd to be known for yourself. You don't want to use Tom, Dick, and Harry's cattle. And after breeding for 10 or 20 or 30 years, you are being identified as a Theo Dickie. He has that kind of cattle. We know his cattle. And we know Bernie's cattle. We know Jan van Zyle's cattle. We know Roland Manga's cattle. So that is also important, to create your own identity as you, for yourself as a breeder. And then we use line breeding as a tool to get cattle a little bit more uniform. You don't want them to be like a hoenderhok or a duivenslag. You want a little bit of system in your breeding. That's why you use line breeding. Coming back to show cattle, so certain lines are dominant in breeding class show cattle with style. Looking at their pedigrees to see how they are put together can give guidelines on how we can breed similar cattle. Show cattle are the ones that people look at and try to breed similar cattle in their own herd. That is your toonvenster. Now, breed plan and pedigrees is the next one. It's nice to have all the different and desirable breed plan data. Pedigrees help us to understand out of which families we can improve certain traits. Some lines keep birth weights down, but keep winning weights relatively high. Others improve milking ability. Very important is to breed cows with a lower mature cow weight relative to other weighing data. We have here, just don't chase it down, because you will lose a lot of things. So keep it relative. Carcass data can be studied and linked to certain bulls and lines, which is important because we want beef. Some cattle can even improve or change more than one trait, which is difficult. High-performing cows, the same that Bernie said. Very often top-producing bulls or cows are descendants of what we call matriarch cows. We know cows that have produced more than one top herd sire. In the US, there are cows that have produced 3 or 4 or even more herd sires. Just for interest's sake, a certain cow from the Hudgins has been cloned. Most breeders only look at bulls. Very few understand the value of great cows and their offspring. Talking about herd sires, because most cattle are not perfect in their appearance, we continuously strive to improve certain weaknesses. We do this continuously. By not knowing some bulls' pedigrees, but also their physical appearance, we can identify bulls that improve weaknesses in our herds. Some combinations of different lines can breed us a desirable animal. The one might be stronger than the other and vice versa. Many herds have used different sires that complement each other. My mouth is so dry now, I have to drink. If we look at an example, there are many examples. Some people are red breeders, but listen at this one now. We can use an example of two lines, like we have the Remington bull from Hudgins, Remington 487. He was a medium-sized bull, and he had a relatively clean underline, and he had a good balance, and he was even a good show bull. He came out of the Rex Crowther line. But then we had, now this is Baba Hudgins' cattle. Baba Hudgins had another bull which was Manso Grande 412, and he was much taller. He was heavy boned, but he was also stylish bull, and he was full of beef. So you have two different bulls. And he used those two bulls to balance his herd. And Henry Koons did the same with the two bulls we named Vernon 489 at the beginning, and the Torgerson bull, and later on he had Vernon 42 and HK Torgerson 4-6, and used the Vernon and the Torgerson line to complement each other, but still bringing in other lines to broaden the genetic base. And then coming back to what I said previously, our own herd's identity. Each breeder should be known by his cattle. Our top herds all have a certain identity. They are not all breed the same cattle, the same type, or the same lines. Top breeders are individualists. Now that is very important. The young breeders, you will become an individual person, an individual breeder. You don't do what every other guy is going to do. You will be known by your own identity. En jy gaan selfvertroue hê, dis wat jy gaan leer. However, they must from time to time broaden the base of the herd genetics. Hierdie mag ons nooit vergeet nie. Therefore, fresh genes must be used from time to time. Okay, a little bit of line breeding. If you look at pedigrees, it will help you a lot, and it will even help you to outcross if it's necessary, so you know your lines. Line breeding is a very popular tool Brahman breeders use. Some do it better than others. Staying below 12% inbreeding coefficient is important, but it's actually a little bit high. So rather stay between 3% and 9% if you want to line breed, which is much better for your cattle. Some geneticists even advise not to line breed, but we Brahman breeders are of a different kind of persons. We line breed. That's what most of us do. And then we always return back to breeding the previous lines. Certain lines can be kept active by line breeding over decades. And I will give you one example. From 1923 to 2010, I've got one line here, and you all know them. And we start with Albacrata. The bull Albacrata came out of the Alabama cow, and his sire was Aristocrata. Manzo's sire was Aristocrata, but he had a different dam, so they split, but they're half brothers. But now we go to Albacrata 37, which came out of the Aristocrata line. Then we go to Sugarland's Rex Manzo, Sugarland's Rex Crata 229. He had 2 times Aristocrata, and he had Manzo as well. The next generation is Bozo, JK Sugar Crata 45. The next generation is Remington, linebred. We go to Wellington, 5 times. Only Remington. What about the other ones? If you take that spider web and you go out of the pedigree, you will find it all over. You will go back to Aristocrata and Manzo. That is line breeding. Furthermore, we cannot look at pedigrees only. We must invest in trips overseas and to other breeders and look at those bulls and their progeny. Using pedigrees goes hand in hand with having seen the cattle we study on paper, as well as some of their progeny. That is very important. I was asked to speak today about my own cattle, but this is for the purpose for the younger breeders, just to get an idea. This is not to teach the older ones, because as I said, they're all individualists. They do it their own way. They don't even listen to me now because it's boring. But for the young guys and the ones that are not quite certain, just get the system, what I'm talking about now. My father's herd was based on the J.T. Garrett cattle, which were Risotto Manzos, just after the 60s. And he went to the Windhoek show and he got a junior champion bull there, which was of that line. And Louis Bosman's cattle were standing on the one road and Alf Koets's were on the other road. My dad came one morning and they were having some whiskeys the night before. And they all came a little bit late to the cattle the next morning, and my dad said to his one guy, "Listen, where's my bull? Oupa se vriend het hom gevat." Now what happened? He stood at Louis Bosman's cattle. He was taken there. He said, "Louis, nou hoe werk hierdie ding nou? Nou Gunther, moenie worry. Jy kom na my veiling, dan vat jy die beste bull daar." Dis hoe dit gewerk het. And this bull was called Secundus. He was the second bull in that year. And he had a very short sheet. And that bull made people in South Africa aware of that you can breed short sheets out of the Brahmans, not only long sheets and bupense. There were genes available. And that was a bit of a mind change. And so the bull went to the Bosmans and they bred him, and there were a lot of offspring and females which went into different herds in South Africa. But then we started from the Bosman cattle, and my dad bought a bull out of the Manzo Grande line. The Norris herd had a bull from Hudgins out of the Manzo Grande line. They were a different bulls. They were all called NCC Sur Grande out of the Manzo Grande line. They had different other lines, but we at that time onto the old Garrett cattle, which were Florida and Risotto Manzo cattle. We used then the Grande and the Risotto, and then we had a very popular line that my dad liked. They were called the Commanders. And they came out of the Imperators, Commander van Dorn and different ones. And my dad always said to me, you know, he was studying those lines, and he said, the Manzo Grande is the beefy one, the compact one with depth and capacity, but your commanders, those are your cows that you breed with. Those are the ones that work in the veld. So he started using those two lines. And that is what I said before. Many breeders have 2 or 3 or 4 lines, but mostly 2 lines, and then balance them. They always use the one and the other one and bring them back, and they go vice versa. And as I said, the commanders are from the Imperator line, which is important. And from there, as a youngster, I started getting interested into why the people look at pedigrees, and the Bosmans were looking at it, my dad was looking at it. And then even Uncle Theo had it. We had 10 books. Those times we didn't have even telephones. What about a computer? So we had those books from the association. Volume 1 was 3 books, and then we had a few in the last volume. 7 was 2 books. There were 10. And from number 1 animal that went to South Africa, and it was registered, till about 6,800 in 1972, they were all in those books. That's what I did on weekends. Looked, because I couldn't go and play soccer. I was on a farm. There was nothing. There was no TV. You couldn't shoot the kudu every weekend because it was boring. So you looked through the books, and that's how I got involved with those pedigrees. And then our herd went to the next step, and my dad became friends with Toby van der Heever, and they used Hans 131, which you all know, Hans Sugarland 131. And this bull, why my dad was interested, because this bull actually on Toby was working on the Imperator cattle. He clicked with the Imperator cattle, and on Toby imported cattle from the AP ranch, from Clive Runnels, grayish and blackish cows. And they were closely related to the commander cattle. They were all going back to the Imperators in the background. And this bull worked because Hans Sugarland 131 was not only a Loxacrata, he had a lot of blood in him which came out of the old Florida cattle. And then they went overseas and they wanted to have another bull back to the Manzos that could work on the Florida cattle. And they identified the bull Elefante Manzo, which was bred by Dellinger. JMD Elefante Manzo 226. And they, as I said, they put them back onto the Florida cattle because that matched. And Elefante 226 was a little bit of a Gujarat type of bull, a little bit of sheath on him, but very long, but a little bit taller, a lot of beef. If you go back to the Elefante line today, probably his best son was Gregory R. Manzo, 386. Long sheath, but a lot of beef. And out of that bull, a lot of bulls followed. Atari, interesting, which was number 601. There were 3 embryo bulls, 600, 601, 602. 601 was Atari. He was the only one with a short sheath. Other ones had long sheaths, like their sire. But the dam was a Rex Crata cow. So he got the sheath from the Rex Crata line, and that's why Hudgins kept that bull, because he was the cleanest underline. There was another bull, his name was Charlie Manzo, long sheath, but a good breeder. And out of those lines came Gibson, Elliott, Mr. VA 202, and then not to forget, there was another Elefante son, Mr. Seebeck 217. But Seebeck 217 was again back onto a Gujarat cow. So he was more Gujarat than the other ones. Then I had the opportunity to go to Texas in 1983. First I went to South Africa and I learned and I did my things and said to my dad, before I go to the farm, I'm going to Texas for a year. He said, okay, we'll organize it. And then I went there. Stayed there, drove around, went to many ranches and over the year. But then one very interesting occasion was the Brahman clinic that John Joyce had in Bowling, that is between V8 and Hudgins on the main road. And this is what we have today, the same. I was 24 years old. There's a lot of youngsters here. Remember this day today. You won't forget it. It's very important, and you must listen to everything that you can pick up here. This is the base of your future. And Johnny Joyce organized that day. He was a herdsman. He was a custom fitter. He took in cattle and he prepared them for the show. And that day, out of the 3 beefiest bulls I've ever seen in that time, for 10 or 20 years, there were 2 bulls there that day. The one was Mr. Seebeck 217 and the other one was Bozo. 2 grey bulls. And I tell you, those bulls had beef. You won't get them better today. You might get bulls today that are more clean and more showish and more perfect. But as far as beef is concerned, you won't get better bulls today. There was another bull, HK Mr. America 61/9. He stood one side and I went to look because there were some speeches and I didn't like them, so I looked at the bulls. And one gentleman was looking at me and he saw me standing at his bull and he stood up and he came over. His name was Henry Clay Koens. He talked to me for 3 minutes and then he said, you come and visit me. And that's another thing I will tell the young people today. Get self-confidence. Talk to the old people. Don't be scared. Even you know something today that you can share, and those people will respect you for it. So have the self-confidence. Go and speak to them. And Henry Clay Koens invited me to his farm. The third bull coming back, I went to the V8 ranch and I saw a bull in a pasture with cows, and his name was Mr. Charlie Manzo 590. We went to look at the bull, and this bull had weak pasterns, but he was full of beef. He was a heavy bull. He was so heavy that his pasterns were weak, and even his front, over his hoofs, you could see the bull is too heavy, he's got too much beef. And then last but not least, his sheath was terrible. I used another word here. And then I said, I don't like this sheath, I don't like those pastons. They said, but he breeds. And I think that's another message for us youngsters here today. Don't just look at papers and bulls, look at the progeny and look what people do with it. And then you decide. And then I had the opportunity to go to shows and drive around. And I got to one certain show, and there was Remington 784, there was Manzo Grande 412, and there was Dido Krata 3889, which is a different line again. We move a little bit away from the Hudgins now. So that was the champion that year, JJ Dido Krata 389. And then I decided to go to Johnny Jeffcoat and look at his cattle and look what he uses and how he does his pedigrees and why does he do that. And it was quite an interesting trip. He had basically the J.T. White cattle, which were Imperator Manzo combination, and the base of Johnny Jeffcoat's cows were all back to the Florida cattle again, which were Imperator influenced. So the whole time we talk about two lines here, maybe with infusion a little bit of something else, which you always bring in. And then when I came back from America, and I started increasing my own cattle, because I always had cattle from a kid, but my dad gave me, and he said, you just do it and carry on. And those cattle became more and more, and then when I started farming myself, I said to myself, well, let me just see where I am now, yeah? I said to myself, I have to carry on now. And I came here to this ranch, and there was a gray bull, which I thought I could use. And he was out of a cow that Llewellyn bought somewhere, and she was a V8565 daughter, which he was a heavily Esther Imperator bred bull. He came from the V8. But the sire of that bull was Tecklenburg 100, which also back had some Imperator, even Suva. And then I carried on, and then when I really had to do something, because my cattle became more and more, and I had to open it up, I picked up a bull in South Africa, and I bought him at Toby van der Heever. He was an old Loriza bull, and he had a very interesting pedigree, which you don't think Loriza would have. He came from Albuquerque's Ponzi line, and he had a lot of Delano Imperator in the background, which came from the Stewarts from Florida. So I used this bull again as an Imperator type of bull, and I made a lot of cows out of that bull because he was doing quite well. And again, good cows that could work in the veld, good milkers, they could raise their calves. And then I said, okay, which other line worked? Went back to the Gregory R. Manzo line, and I looked. And I decided there's another bull at Loriza. They imported him from Texas. He came from the Hudginses, JDH Mr. Manzo 130. And he was a double-bred Gregory Manzo. So I again could get hold of that line. I didn't lose it, and I could carry on using those lines. And that bull was actually a nice-looking bull, and he went to be an interbreed champion in Windhoek. And then I had a third bull which was related to both of them, so I could use them on that line and that line on both. And for interest's sake, I made a lot of cows which they even are still today on the farm, and Llewellyn saw some of them, nice beefy blocky cows, above medium, and they were line bred, or they are line bred, 1/8 on the sire side and 1/8 on the dam side, back to Mr. Manzo 130. And what I'm saying is, since the 60s, when my dad started and I carried on, and up to today, we basically used two lines from the beginning out of the Manzo Grande, which later changed a little bit out of it because we couldn't get hold of it. The Imperators, we could always keep going in the background. Okay, current breeding. I had the opportunity several times to go overseas with Llewellyn, and we talked a lot. We spent hours after hours discussing certain bulls and their pedigrees. fortunately, we have the same interest about breeding cattle, and that brought us closer together, and that's why we phone each other quite often, and we talk about these and what mistakes we do, because this all sounds fine. We do a lot of mistakes as well. You get a lot of surprises, but you get a lot of good ones as well. And another tip, if I may tell some of our younger breeders or the breeders that are not the younger persons or the younger breeders, if you study someone else's cattle that you are interested in, get to know them, study those lines, get to know those cattle. You know, my dad, he know the Bosman's cattle even better than they themselves knew it, because he was studying it flat out, and that's what I learned from him. Manny Moritz once told me, he said, my dad told him, jy moet van daai koei moet jy 'n bulkalf koop. And that's how they talked. They knew they could help each other. And they weren't scared to give tips to other ones. It was not close to them. They didn't keep it to themselves. Hulle het gedeel. Toby van der Heever dieselfde, because my dad could find out this bull is working on the imperators. He's not necessarily working on the hunt cattle. Everybody thought it would be. But that was not actually. He was a good breeder on the hunt cattle, but on the imperators he worked. Yeah, and then in today's time now, where we are today, I still had to find an imperator bull somewhere, and I got a little semen, and this bull has imperator in between, but on the sire side and dam side again, a 1/8 and a 1/8 is going back to JJ Didokrata 389. This is wrong here on the paper. And I used this bull again to breed me some cows that I can use in the veld, which are hardy, which are producing. They are not the biggest cows, they are not the most pretty cows, but they are very good producers. And you can work on those cows again with other lines. And then going back to the other lines, because the imperators are not the most important ones, you mustn't do them not use them a lot too much, because they have their problems as well. You want the beefy ones, and you concentrate on those ones, the bigger ones, and the more capacity ones. And I thought I must find a bull back to what I had many years ago out of the Sugarlands line. And I went to Llewellyn, and we looked around, and I found a bull here. On the sire side, he's a power son, which I thought would be nice for us in Namibia. He's not the biggest, tallest bull, but he's got a lot of capacity, and that's what we need, because our environment doesn't allow us to go bigger above a certain point, then we lose. We must go to the medium, and power was that on the Manzo side. And I wanted the bull out of the Sugarlands lines on the dam side, which I found. And this bull has, which I got from Llewellyn, he has got 3 times hunt in his dams pedigree, and 2 times bozo. And that is what I call a herd bull. Very rugged bull, very strong bull, very high capacity. Out of him I have currently a bull, a son, out of JDH Amos' daughter. Then I have a young imperator bull, and I have 2 bulls out of the Hudgins, but all going back to my old lines. So now the conclusion about this, before we go to an open discussion, I would have a short conclusion. I hope that the young breeders here today can take home a few ideas on how to use pedigrees. Most important is probably to realize that one must have a plan forward. Decide on which lines to use in combination with breed plan. Become a breeder that is seen as an individualist, and build a herd that can be identified with yourselves. An example, if you want to shoot an elephant behind the ear, you need to load your rifle with high quality rounds, one by one, and concentrate. And then you shoot, but you don't shoot with a shotgun, because you will miss the complete elephant. So decide what you want to do and keep by it and have a system. Like ons blokkoppe, doen hom so. Thank you. And now I would really like to have an open discussion. But remember, I'm not a computer, even if people think I know a lot of pedigrees. The computer, I look inside this computer. And at work, I'm sitting over lunchtime, I don't go home. I take my food. The doctor says don't eat too fast. That's why I sit before the computer. I take my coffee and I have time. And I sit and I have saved on my computer Namibian breed plan, South African, Australian, and American. And then I go and I search my bulls and I compare the Australian EBVs with the American EPDs and the Namibian one and the South African ones, and I look at the breed plan data and I look at the carcass data, and I've got time for this, but I don't have it here. So remember, get this stuff on computer and check it up. Thank you. Are there any questions? Can we discuss something? Was my Engels goed genoeg?
Jurg het na my verwys, maar hy het voor my groot geword, en ek is baie lief vir hom, baie, want sy pa, ek is 'n half Duitser, maar sy pa is nou 'n suiwer Duitser. Maar suiwer Duitser is 'n gevaarlike ding, laat ek nou vir jou sê. Dan kom ons, dan praat ons Pedigrees in die aand, dan sê hy, het jy al die son sien opkom hier by my? Dan sê ek nee. Dan sê hy, wel, hierdie bottel gaan ons nou drink, tot die son opkom. En dan drink ons die bottel tot die son opkom. En hy het 'n goeie ma ook. Vrou Schleder, dan bring sy koffie, dan sy bekommerd oor ons, dan bring sy weer koffie, dan bring sy weer koffie, dan bring sy weer koffie, dan word dit 4 uur, dan word dit 5 uur, dan sien ons die son opkom. Dan sê hy, nee, daai whisky bottel moet klaar. So, maar hy het ook saam met my gegaan, waar het ons hier gegaan? Colombia toe. En ons het ure en ure se pedigrees. Hy en Dave Molly. O, Here, as jy hulle 3 by mekaar kry, of hulle 2, die groot moeilikheid. Hulle hou nie op nie. Hulle was pedigrees en ons het hulle geken. En om terug te kom op hierdie imperators en hierdie soort van pedigrees wat hy noem. Mens moet verstaan, wat is 'n imperator? Waar kom hy vandaan? 'n imperator is 'n Gujarat. En die Garcias het Gujaratte. Daai Indus wat hulle lankal Indus genoem het by die Garcias, is nie Indus regtig nie, is Gujaratte. Ek het Takspino 30/2 gebruik. Is 'n Gujarat. Gujarat koeie by my gemaak. So kan jy Rexkrata 229, hy's in Nelorba. Ek het 'n half Nelorba ingevoer, in die kalvers by my gestaan, dan kon jy 229 se kalvers daar sien. Nelora. So, as jy 'n kudde het, gelukkig het ek 'n groot kudde, kan jy sekere lyne maak. En dis wat ons maak. Ons maak Gujarat lyne, ons maak Nelor lyne, ons maak Mansou lyne. Ek praat net van die witte, ek praat nie van die rooies. Die rooies is ook 'n Patricks, maar jy moet jou eie lyne maak, sodat jy weet, hierdie lyn saam met daai lyn kan vir jou sukses gee. Baster hulle. Wie kan hulle komplementeer mekaar. En dan 'n ander ding wat ons baie mooi moet oordink is die melk. Ons kan nie beeste sonder melk maak nie. Gelukkig is ons nou EDB's met melksyfers, regtig. En ek kan vir u sê, ek gebruik nie 'n bil onder 5 nie, vergeet dit. As ek sien party ouens gebruik bulle met 0 en minus en so aan, ek sal nooit slaap nie, regtig. Ek sal nie eers daaroor dink nie, ek slag hulle. Iemand het gepraat oor 'n swart bul. Eerstens moet jy jou mark kyk. By my is 'n swart bul, ek kan hom aan niemand verkoop nie, ek slag hom. Eenvoudig. Hulle wil hom nie hê nie. My mark wil hom nie hê nie. Maar Jurg, is lekker om by jou te wees. By die Sleeders het ek altyd so lekker gekuier. Sy ma was jou ma lewe nie meer nie. Leef, stuur tog vir haar groete. Jurg is 'n goeie vrou daai. Maar in elk geval, dankie. Ek wou net sê, hy verwys na my, maar hy was 'n oulike ou seentjie gewees. Hy het mooi groot geword daar.
Dankie, Matteo.